GhastlyGarlic Episode 25. The Haunting Skies of the L-8, A Spanish Tale of Jealousy and Horror. Chapter 1, The Beginning of the End. Spain, 1942. The world was engulfed in the flames of World War II, and the chaos reached even the most serene corners of the earth. Amidst this turmoil, two Spanish aviators, Ramón and Javier, found themselves in the service of the U.S. Navy. They were assigned to the L-8, an L-class blimp known for its patrol missions along the Pacific coast. The dirigible was tasked with the vital mission of detecting enemy submarines that threatened the American shoreline. However, neither Ramón nor Javier could have predicted that their mission would lead them into a labyrinth of jealousy, betrayal, and supernatural horror. Ramón and Javier had always shared a deep bond, one forged by their shared heritage and the trials of war. Ramón, the elder, was a seasoned aviator with a stoic demeanor and a calm disposition. His experience and level-headedness had earned him the respect of his peers. Javier, on the other hand, was younger and more impulsive. His passion and determination were matched only by his quick temper. Despite their differences, the two friends were inseparable, their camaraderie evident to all who knew them. Their friendship was put to the ultimate test when they both fell in love with the same woman, Isabella. She was a nurse they had met during their time in San Francisco, a city that provided a brief respite from the horrors of war. Isabella was beautiful, compassionate, and kind-hearted. Her presence brought a sense of normalcy to their lives, a rare comfort in a world consumed by conflict. It soon became clear that Isabella's affections leaned towards Ramón. She admired his quiet strength and unwavering resolve. This realization sparked a burning jealousy in Javier, one that festered and grew with each passing day. The tension between the two friends began to affect their performance during missions. The once harmonious partnership was now marred by suspicion and resentment. Even their superiors noticed the growing rift between them, but the demands of war left little room for addressing personal conflicts. On a particularly foggy morning, the L-8 was dispatched on a routine patrol mission. The air was thick with mist, and visibility was low. The mission was simple: search for enemy submarines and report any sightings. As the blimp floated above the Pacific, the silence inside the gondola was palpable. The only sounds were the hum of the engines and the occasional crackle of the radio. The tension between Ramón and Javier was almost tangible. "Ramón, do you think she really loves you?" Javier's voice broke the silence, his tone sharp and accusatory. Ramón glanced at his friend, his expression unreadable. "This is not the time, Javier. Focus on the mission," he replied calmly. But Javier couldn't let it go. The eerie silence of the blimp only amplified his thoughts, driving him further into a spiral of jealousy and rage. As they continued their patrol, the fog grew denser, enveloping the L-8 in a shroud of white. The world outside became an indistinct blur, adding to the sense of isolation within the gondola. Suddenly, the instruments went haywire. The compass spun uncontrollably, and the radio crackled with static. Ramón and Javier exchanged worried glances, their personal animosity momentarily forgotten. "Something's wrong," Ramón muttered, adjusting the controls in an attempt to stabilize the blimp. Before they could react, a strange shadow appeared in the fog. It was a submarine, but not like any they had seen before. Its sleek, black form was almost ghostly, cutting through the water with an otherworldly grace. The submarine's appearance was unsettling, its presence eerie and foreboding. They attempted to report their sighting, but the radio was dead. No matter how they adjusted the dials, all they received was static. As they circled the submarine, it vanished into the depths, leaving them with a sense of impending doom. The encounter was brief, but haunting, a prelude to the horrors that awaited them. As the hours passed with no further sightings, tension returned to the gondola. Javier's jealousy reached its boiling point. In a fit of rage, he accused Ramón of sabotaging their mission to make him look bad. "You think you're better than me, don't you? Just because Isabella chose you," Javier shouted, advancing towards Ramón, his eyes filled with fury. Ramón tried to calm him, but Javier's anger was uncontrollable. In the ensuing struggle, they failed to notice the approach of an enemy aircraft. The blimp was suddenly under fire, and they had no choice but to crash land on a remote island. Their once promising mission had turned into a nightmare, and the island would soon reveal terrors beyond their darkest fears. Chapter 2, The Encounter. As the L-8 drifted closer to the ground, the situation grew dire. The enemy aircraft had severely damaged the blimp, and the controls were barely responsive. Smoke filled the gondola, and the acrid smell of burning metal and fabric permeated the air. Ramón and Javier fought to stabilize the descent, their previous conflict momentarily forgotten in the face of imminent danger. The blimp crash-landed on a remote, uncharted island, its impact cushioned by the dense foliage. The violent landing left both aviators bruised and disoriented, but alive. As they stumbled out of the wreckage, the oppressive heat and humidity of the jungle engulfed them. The island was a wild and untamed place, its dense vegetation and unfamiliar sounds adding to their sense of isolation. "Are you all right?" Ramón asked, helping Javier to his feet. Javier nodded, wincing as he touched a cut on his forehead. "Yeah, I think so. But what now?" Before Ramón could respond, they were surrounded by enemy soldiers, their faces obscured by the dense undergrowth. The soldiers, who were initially cautious, soon recognized the aviators as potential prisoners of war. Ramón and Javier were bound and blindfolded, their weapons confiscated. Their captors marched them through the jungle, the journey long and grueling. The aviators could hear the rustling of leaves, the calls of strange animals, and the distant roar of the ocean. The unfamiliar sounds added to their growing unease. They were taken to a hidden base, a place that seemed more myth than reality. The base was a labyrinth of tunnels and makeshift buildings, concealed from the outside world. The enemy commander, a tall man with a scarred face and cold, calculating eyes, interrogated them. He was relentless, demanding information about their mission and the mysterious submarine they had encountered. When their answers proved unsatisfactory, the torture began. The days in captivity turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Ramón and Javier were subjected to horrific torture, both physical and psychological. Their captors were relentless, employing every method to break their spirits and extract information. They were starved, beaten, and subjected to sleep deprivation. The most harrowing were the brainwashing sessions, where they were drugged and exposed to bizarre, nightmarish imagery. In a dark, damp cell, Ramón and Javier would hear the screams of other prisoners echoing through the corridors. Sometimes, the screams seemed to be their own, as reality blurred into a haze of pain and hallucination. Their captors would whisper lies, turning them against each other, deepening the rift of jealousy and mistrust. "Isabella never loved you, Ramón. She chose Javier," a captor would hiss into Ramón's ear during a particularly brutal session. "Ramón betrayed you, Javier. He sold you out for his freedom," another would whisper to Javier, sowing seeds of paranoia. The torture was relentless, designed to break their minds as well as their bodies. They were forced to endure simulated drownings, electric shocks, and excruciating physical stress positions. Their captors delighted in their suffering, experimenting with new methods to inflict pain. The thin line between reality and nightmare disintegrated, leaving them in a perpetual state of terror. Their mental states deteriorated as they were subjected to cruel experiments. Strange symbols were carved into their skin, rituals performed under the guise of scientific research. They were forced to ingest mysterious substances that induced terrifying hallucinations. Faces of the dead, disembodied voices, and shadowy figures haunted their waking hours. The torturers reveled in their fear, turning every moment into a waking nightmare. As they lay in their dark, damp cell, Ramón and Javier would whisper to each other, trying to hold on to their sanity. Their conversations were often disjointed, their thoughts muddled by the drugs and torture. They spoke of home, of Isabella, and of their desire to escape the hellish prison. One night, amidst the chaos of an air raid, they saw their chance. Using a hidden shard of metal, they managed to break free from their chains and overpower a guard. Their journey through the dark, labyrinthine corridors of the prison was fraught with danger and eerie occurrences. The walls seemed to close in on them, and shadows moved independently of any light source. Whispering voices echoed through the halls, growing louder and more insistent as they neared the exit. The air was thick with a sense of impending doom. Despite their weakened state, they managed to reach the jungle. The natural sounds of the night were replaced by a haunting silence, broken only by the distant wails of spirits. The trees seemed to twist and contort, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands to grasp at the fleeing aviators. Chapter 3: The Jungle of Lost Souls. As Ramón and Javier stumbled through the dense undergrowth of the jungle, the oppressive heat and humidity clung to their skin like a shroud. The air was thick with the scent of decay and the distant calls of unknown creatures. Every step was a struggle, their bodies weakened by months of torture and deprivation. Their minds, already on the brink of madness, were further strained by the eerie silence that surrounded them. The jungle was an uncharted maze, its twisted paths and dense foliage providing ample cover, but also creating an almost suffocating sense of claustrophobia. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy, casting long, sinister shadows that seemed to shift and move of their own accord. Each rustle of leaves or snap of a twig sent shivers down their spines, their nerves frayed by the constant fear of being recaptured. As they made their way deeper into the jungle, they came across an ancient, overgrown temple. The structure was covered in vines and moss, its stone walls etched with strange, otherworldly symbols. The air around the temple felt colder, and a palpable sense of dread hung in the atmosphere. Despite their fear, they decided to seek refuge within its crumbling walls. The interior of the temple was even more unsettling. Flickering shadows cast by their makeshift torches danced across the walls, revealing intricate carvings that depicted scenes of sacrifice and torment. The air was thick with the scent of mold and decay, and an eerie, otherworldly whisper seemed to emanate from the very stones themselves. In the heart of the temple, they found a large chamber with an altar at its center. The altar was adorned with ancient relics and offerings, long since decayed and forgotten. As they approached, they felt an almost magnetic pull towards the altar, as if an unseen force was drawing them closer. Their minds, already fragile from their captivity, struggled to comprehend the strange energy that permeated the chamber. Suddenly, the air grew colder, and a ghostly figure materialized before them. The apparition was a woman, her translucent form flickering like a candle in the wind. She was dressed in ancient garb, her eyes hollow and filled with sorrow. Ramón and Javier recoiled in terror, but the apparition spoke, her voice a haunting echo that reverberated through the chamber. "You have entered a place of great suffering," she whispered, her voice tinged with sadness. "This temple is cursed, its walls stained with the blood of the innocent. Those who enter are doomed to relive the torments of the past." As she spoke, the chamber seemed to shift and change. The walls became transparent, revealing scenes of horror and despair. They saw visions of ancient rituals, where prisoners were sacrificed to appease vengeful spirits. The screams of the victims echoed through the chamber, their faces twisted in agony. Ramón and Javier were transfixed by the visions, unable to look away. The scenes of torture and sacrifice mirrored their own experiences, blurring the line between past and present. They felt the pain and fear of the victims as if it were their own, their minds pushed to the brink of madness. Desperate to escape, they stumbled out of the chamber and into the labyrinthine corridors of the temple. The whispers grew louder, and the shadows seemed to close in on them. Every turn brought new horrors, their path blocked by ghostly apparitions and nightmarish visions. The temple was a living entity, feeding off their fear and despair. As they neared the exit, they were confronted by the ghostly figure once more. Her eyes were filled with sorrow and regret, her voice a mournful wail. "You cannot escape the curse," she cried. "The spirits of the damned will haunt you until the end of your days." With a final, desperate push, they broke free from the temple and fled into the jungle. The eerie silence had returned, but the sense of dread remained. The jungle itself seemed to be alive, its twisted paths and dense foliage creating an ever-present sense of menace. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy, casting long, sinister shadows that seemed to shift and move of their own accord. As they stumbled through the jungle, their minds were filled with the horrors they had witnessed. The visions of the temple had left an indelible mark on their psyche, blurring the line between reality and nightmare. They could still hear the whispers of the spirits, their ghostly voices a constant reminder of the curse that plagued them. The journey was long and arduous, their progress hampered by their weakened state and the unforgiving terrain. Every step was a struggle, their bodies and minds pushed to the limit. They knew that they had to find a way off the island, but the path to freedom seemed fraught with peril. Chapter 4: The Final Descent into Madness. Days turned into weeks as Ramón and Javier wandered through the jungle, their bodies growing weaker with each passing day. The lack of food and clean water took its toll, and the constant fear of being recaptured gnawed at their sanity. The oppressive heat and humidity made every movement an ordeal, their clothes clinging to their sweat-drenched bodies. One night, as they huddled together for warmth, Ramón confided in Javier. "I can't shake the feeling that we are being watched," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Every time I close my eyes, I see those spirits. I hear their whispers." Javier nodded, his eyes wide with fear. "I feel it too. It's like they are all around us, waiting for us to let our guard down. I don't know how much more of this I can take." As they continued their journey, the jungle seemed to grow more hostile. The trees twisted into grotesque shapes, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Strange, unidentifiable sounds filled the air, and the very ground seemed to shift beneath their feet. The line between reality and nightmare blurred further, their minds unable to distinguish between the two. One evening, they stumbled upon a clearing. In the center stood a large, ancient tree, its gnarled roots entwined around a stone altar. The air around the clearing was thick with an unnatural stillness, and the sense of dread was almost palpable. As they approached the altar, they noticed strange symbols carved into the stone, similar to those they had seen in the temple. Ramón and Javier exchanged uneasy glances. "Do you think this is another part of the curse?" Javier asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ramón nodded, his eyes scanning the surrounding jungle. "It has to be. We need to be careful." Despite their fear, they decided to rest in the clearing. The jungle seemed to close in around them, the shadows growing longer and darker. As night fell, the temperature dropped, and an eerie fog began to creep in. The fog was thick and cold, swirling around them like a living entity. As they huddled together for warmth, the fog seemed to take on a life of its own. It formed into shapes, indistinct and shifting, but undeniably humanoid. The ghostly figures moved silently through the clearing, their hollow eyes fixed on the two aviators. Ramón and Javier watched in terror as the figures drew closer. Their forms were translucent, their faces twisted in expressions of sorrow and rage. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, filling their minds with a cacophony of voices. "Why did you come here?" One of the figures whispered, its voice a mournful echo. "You have disturbed our rest. You will never escape." The figures reached out with ghostly hands, their touch cold and painful. Ramón and Javier screamed in agony, their minds filled with visions of torment and despair. The spirits of the jungle were relentless, their anger and sorrow overwhelming. In a desperate attempt to escape, Ramón and Javier fled the clearing, their minds shattered by the horrors they had witnessed. The jungle seemed to close in around them, its twisted paths and dense foliage creating a maze of terror. The ghostly figures pursued them, their whispers growing louder and more insistent. As they ran, they stumbled upon a hidden cave. The entrance was narrow and overgrown with vines, but it offered a temporary respite from the pursuing spirits. Inside, the cave was dark and damp, its walls covered in strange, phosphorescent moss that emitted a faint, eerie glow. The air inside the cave was cold and still, and the sense of dread was almost overwhelming. The whispers of the spirits echoed through the narrow passages, their ghostly voices a constant reminder of the curse that plagued them. Ramón and Javier huddled together, their minds and bodies pushed to the brink of madness. "We can't stay here," Ramón whispered, his voice trembling. "We need to find a way off this island." Javier nodded, his eyes wide with fear. "But how? Every path we take leads us deeper into this nightmare. It's like the island itself is alive, trying to keep us here." As they sat in the darkness, a strange sense of calm washed over them. The whispers faded, replaced by a profound silence. In that silence, they heard a faint, rhythmic sound, the distant roar of the ocean. It was a reminder of the world beyond the island, a glimmer of hope in their darkest hour. Summoning the last of their strength, they made their way towards the sound. The journey was long and arduous, the jungle offering one final challenge. The path was fraught with peril, the shadows and whispers a constant presence. But with each step, they drew closer to their goal. Chapter 5: The Horrors Unleashed. After days of grueling travel, Ramón and Javier finally reached the edge of the jungle. The sight of the ocean filled them with a sense of relief and despair. The waves crashed against the rocky shore, the salt spray a reminder of the freedom they so desperately sought. But the island was not done with them yet. As they approached the shoreline, they saw a small, abandoned boat. It was old and weathered, its hull covered in barnacles and seaweed. Despite its dilapidated state, it offered a glimmer of hope. They could use it to escape the island and leave the horrors behind. With renewed determination, they dragged the boat to the water's edge. The task was arduous, their weakened bodies struggling with the heavy weight. The ghostly whispers returned, their voices filled with anger and sorrow. The spirits of the island were not ready to let them go. As they pushed the boat into the water, a thick fog rolled in, obscuring their vision. The fog was cold and oppressive, wrapping around them like a shroud. The ghostly figures emerged from the mist, their hollow eyes fixed on the aviators. "You cannot escape," the spirits whispered. "You are ours." Ramón and Javier scrambled into the boat, their hands shaking with fear. They paddled furiously, the small craft cutting through the water. But the fog grew thicker, the spirits relentless in their pursuit. The air was filled with the wails of the damned, their cries echoing across the water. The journey was a nightmare. The fog was so dense that they could barely see their own hands in front of their faces. The whispers grew louder, their ghostly voices a constant reminder of the curse that plagued them. The boat rocked violently, the waves crashing against its sides. As they paddled, the ocean seemed to come alive. The water churned and roiled, strange shapes moving beneath the surface. The spirits of the island had followed them, their wrath unleashed upon the sea. Ramón and Javier could feel the cold touch of ghostly hands, their fingers grasping at their limbs. The boat was tossed about by the waves, the ocean's fury a reflection of the island's anger. Ramón and Javier clung to the sides of the boat, their minds filled with visions of torment and despair. The line between reality and nightmare was gone, their sanity slipping away with each passing moment. Suddenly, a massive wave rose from the depths, towering over the small boat. The water was black and cold, filled with the faces of the damned. The wave crashed down upon them, engulfing the boat and its occupants. The world dissolved into darkness, the cold embrace of the ocean pulling them under. Ramón and Javier were never seen again. The boat was found days later, adrift and empty. There was no sign of the aviators, their fate a mystery. The island remained shrouded in fog, its dark secrets hidden from the world. Epilogue: The unanswered question. The disappearance of Ramón and Javier became a legend, a tale of horror and madness passed down through the generations. The island was avoided by sailors, its cursed reputation a deterrent to all who valued their sanity. The ancient temple and the ghostly spirits remained, their whispers a haunting reminder of the curse that plagued the island. Isabella, back in San Francisco, received the news with a heavy heart. She mourned the loss of her friends, her thoughts filled with the memories of happier times. The mystery of their disappearance haunted her, the unanswered questions a constant source of sorrow. Had Ramón and Javier truly fallen victim to a supernatural curse? Or had their minds been so damaged by their captivity that they could no longer distinguish between reality and nightmare? The truth remained elusive, hidden in the shadows of the jungle and the depths of the ocean. The tale of the L-8 and its ill-fated crew became a cautionary story, a reminder of the horrors that lurk just beyond the edge of reason. And as the years passed, the island remained a place of darkness, its secrets buried beneath the fog and the waves. But for those who dared to listen, the whispers of the spirits could still be heard, their mournful voices a testament to the enduring power of the curse. And the question remained, what truly happened to Ramón and Javier? Were they driven mad by the horrors they endured, or had they been consumed by the vengeful spirits of the island? The answer lay hidden in the mists of time, a mystery that would never be solved. The end.
Thanks for tuning in to our podcast. If you enjoyed our exploration of ghosts, mythical creatures, and urban legends, please share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling episodes. Until next time, my beloved listeners.